0.01.01.48.0754. Xuvats awoke to the gentle patter of rain. They lay pooled in the bottom of the crater created by their landing, a thin film of water building up on their membrane. The sensation was acceptable. Being unfamiliar with this planet and its resources, Xuvats thought it prudent to collect and store some of the rainwater in its contractile vacuole. In the crater beneath and around its membrane, Xuvats found the smashed remnants of its vessel, and collected a piece, about the size of a quisp, and stored that in a vacuole as well. They would need its data when the time came to grow into crystals. Xuvats climbed out of the hole to analyze its surroundings, and found itself in an open clearing, surrounded by forest. In the center of the clearing stood several large stones that were carved out and stacked in a peculiar pattern, which they approached to study more closely. There were 23 stones in all, 20 upright stones of varying heights, a few of which were toppled by time and circumstance. Additionally, there were 3 capstones, one of which had fallen, taking a supporting column along with it. The upright stones were arranged from smallest to tallest, in a large arc ending at the capstone assembly. Xuvats traveled the length of the marked arc, and estimated that the structure was used to map the trajectory of moons over the course of a year. They approached the collapsed capstone to examine the extent of the damage and its potential cause. Several cubits away, Xuvats found a tree stump with several axe marks on it, where the tree had been cut, presumably intentionally, to topple the capstone and render the site useless. Without warning, a giant weasel pounced, narrowly missing Xuvats. Instinctively, they responded by violently extending a pseudopod, heavily wounding the beast to frighten it off. Instead, the weasel pounced again to bite into the alien's translucent hide. The pain lit up Xuvats' nucleus, and it lashed out with rage, this time forming its pseudopod into a thick, axe-like blade, and separating the weasel's head from its body. The alien amoeba then slumped over the creature's severed head to absorb it into its membrane, to be catalogued and indexed later. 17.55.01.48.0754. The field descended a steep slope as Xuvats found roughly 60 steps cut into the ground and edged with half-buried tree trunks. As Xuvats descended them, they acknowledged that shoots of grass grew up between large flat obsidian stones that plated the hillside like home. At the bottom of the stairs, a flat-topped archway opened into the hillside, outside of which the plasmoid found the remains of several animals. Passing through the 60-cubit archway into the darkness, Xuvats continued for about 15 cubits before coming to another passage that opened to the left. They followed that corridor another 20 cubits before they became aware of a slight breeze coming through the stone wall on their left. On inspecting the area, Xuvats found there was hidden an entrance, with a glowing symbol etched into the stone that resembled a flame. When they moved away, the glowing symbol receded, and when they moved forward, it lit up again. Xuvats extended the pseudopod out and began to slip it through the narrow gap under the entrance, and was assaulted with a burst of flames descending from the ceiling. Singed and undulating in pain, they finally squeezed under the door into the adjacent room. This new room was about 10 cubits square, but the east wall had collapsed into a pile of onyx brick and soil, giving it an angular shape. There were 2 doors on the west wall, and a flying beast circling the room, which occasionally landed to sift through the debris. Identifying a new scent, the beast wandered over to Xuvats and began sniffing. The plasmoid, not detecting any threat, took the time to analyze the creature and its mannerisms before slowly moving towards the doors. The first door was a simple wooden one, and slipping a pseudopod under it, Xuvats could see stairs leading down. The far door was barred, beyond which they found a short stool next to a small table that held a single unlit lantern. The passage then continued about 25 cubits and opened into a large room with a large stone statue of a humanoid figure at the far end. The statue stood on a round base, about which circled a moat of fire, whose flames engulfed the figure to the waist. Another flying beast circled this room, and on seeing the amoebic Xuvats, it squawked. In response to the noise, the flames around the statue diminished, and a cone of fire shot from an orifice in its face, out 25 cubits. The flying beast barely avoided being scorched. Presumably, it blamed Xuvats for this, as it dove for the globulous form on the floor. Seeing this incoming creature, the alien lunged forward with a needle-sharp pseudopod, but the flying beast dodged the incoming attack and landed on Xuvats. It thrust its proboscis down at them, but Xuvats retracted the area of its membrane, creating a hole, and the beast struck only the dirt floor. Swiftly, Xuvats slammed the opening closed, crushing the creature's head, then absorbed the corpse for cataloging and indexing. The room contained 3 more doors along the wall the alien amoeba had entered, and another opposite them, alone in the middle of that wall. Xuvats extrapolated that the first door to the right had a 90% chance of connecting to the passage where they had been burned from above. The next 2 along that wall also had high probabilities of corridors beyond them, so the alien chose the solitary door first, as it was most likely to open to another room. Unable to squeeze under this door, they bashed against it a few times, until there was a hole large enough to pour themselves through. The room on the other side was 60 cubits cubed, and Xuvats became immediately aware of 2 figures, one opposite them and the other to their right, near the wall. In the center of the room stood a large statue of a golden ring, made of intertwined serpents, each eating the tail of the one before them. Broken colored glass littered the floor about the statue, and Xuvats extrapolated that it had once formed a colored window at the center of the ring. The tiny creature to the right moved towards Xuvats on long, spindly legs. As it did, the creature probed for Xuvats' mind. "No, thank you," Xuvats responded out loud. Without hesitation, they thrust out a pseudopod about the length and shape of a javelin and skewered the creature. Xuvats again absorbed the creature for indexing, but sensing some type of toxin within the beast, they extracted the poison into a small vacuole for analysis. The larger, stationary creature on the opposite side of the room slowly began to approach on 2 hairy legs. It carried a large metal plate that it held in front of itself for protection. With the other hand, it wiped its tearing eyes. "What in the heavens are you?" the creature spoke aloud, drawing a long-bladed weapon. "Are you another servant of the Forsaken Tower?" Xuvats transformed themselves into a blue, translucent reflection of the creature, mimicking it down to the armor, but without fur. "In the heavens, I am called Xuvats of Toth M99, Xuvats replied, recognizing the language of the Celestials. "What is the Forsaken Tower? How did it come to be forsaken? Who are its servants? Why are you looking for them?" They waited for a response, but the biped simply stood there, mouth agape. "This means of communication is not ideal. May I communicate telepathically?" "No!" the hairy biped replied sternly. "That bloody Neogi hatchling had me under its spell for 2 days. No more telepathy, thank you." The bipedal creature stepped in a slow circle around Xuvats, examining them. "You're sentient? What manner of creature are you?" "I am a plasmoid from the Centaura Keratoid Zone. What manner of creature are you?" "Bugbear from Healy. Do you eat?" The bugbear responded, its stomach growling almost as if on command. "I can consume most forms of organic matter." Bugbear Xuvats held out a hand, and the partially digested head of a giant weasel floated into the palm. "Would you like this?" "No, thank you." The bugbear covered its nose from the stench, and Xuvats reabsorbed the weasel's head. The bugbear looked around, located its pack strewn across the corner of the room, and began rummaging for any remaining rations, which they devoured immediately. As she ate, they questioned each other. Xuvats learned that Rondel was a 205-year-old paladin who had spent her entire life hunting servants of the Forsaken Tower, in the hopes of reclaiming a sacred holy relic that had been taken. She'd heard a rumor that had led her here, only to be ensnared by the Neogi hatchling, to be used as amusement until Xuvats had shown up. Rondel learned that Xuvats was exploring and cataloging this planet and its inhabitants for the knowledge of the greater collective. "May I join you in your exploration, Rondel?" Explaining how invaluable the experience would be to study bugbear behavior directly. After a brief rest, they decided to continue deeper into the maze. The door to the left of the entrance Xuvats had broken through was open to stairs leading down, and they chose to save that journey until they had cleared this floor. The next door, working clockwise, was a simple wooden door that opened into an empty triangular room, barely 5 cubits across. "There is undead evil here," Rondel said slowly, moving about the room as she drew her sword. "There!" Xuvats lashed out in the direction the paladin pointed, but caught only air. As if mimicking Xuvats, a pseudopod of darkness shot out at the alien, causing Xuvats to recoil in pain. At the point of impact, Xuvats could feel the membrane necrose. Rondel stabbed at it as it recoiled, but also missed the malleable darkness. It lashed back in return, but the paladin was able to deflect the blow with her shield. Xuvats, still in bugbear form, sliced through the shadow with an axe-shaped arm. And as the shadow tried to retreat, Rondel stabbed into it with her sword, and it dissipated into smoke. The room immediately brightened, revealing a floor littered with coins and gems. Seeing the bugbear begin to pick up the coins, Xuvats asked, "Are these shiny metal discs important? Are they the servants of the Forsaken Tower?" "No. These coins are what we trade for supplies and equipment," she explained. "So they are important. I will assist you." Xuvats relaxed into a puddle on the floor, and Rondel had to take a few steps back to avoid stepping in them. A moment later, they reshaped into a vaguely humanoid form with a belly full of coins and gems. Rondel watched in amazement as the plasmoid shifted and tumbled the objects around inside themselves, and then lowered 4 neatly stacked piles of coins, sorted according to their metals. Back in the square room, the two proceeded to the next door to find it locked. The paladin asked if Xuvats could slip under the door, but the space was too small. "Are you able to pick the lock?" she asked when that failed. "Please explain pick the lock." Rondel explained how a lock and key worked in principle, and then explained that the picking was the act of opening the lock without the key. "How intriguing," Xuvats replied, placing a hand over the lock. "I would like to try lock-picking." Before she could respond, Rondel heard the door latch click, and the door swung open, and she looked at Xuvats, mouth agape. "The mechanics of this lock seem quite rudimentary," Xuvats explained. In the center of the room, they found a skeleton standing with a sword drawn and a sealed envelope in their free hand. Xuvats also noticed a tiny creature clinging to the ceiling. As they approached the skeleton, it backed away from them, keeping them just out of arm's reach, until the bugbear reached out with her long arms and smashed away half of its ribcage with her sword. Xuvats reached out to snatch the envelope, but the skeleton dodged and the alien broke the arm off at the elbow, sending it clattering to the floor, letter in hand. The skeleton retaliated towards Rondel with its sword, but being off balance from losing an appendage, the swing went wide. Disturbed by the noise, the bat hanging in the corner flew down and landed on Rondel's back, but was unable to bite through her chainmail. She reached back to try and grab the rodent, scaring it into the air, where she took the opportunity to swing while it was in flight, and sent it lifeless to the floor. Xuvats reached out a pseudopod, grabbed the skeleton by the ankle, and then slid inside its armor, assuming the shape of a humanoid once again, and restraining the skeleton inside of its membrane. They stood there for a moment, a translucent blue humanoid with a visible skeleton. Then Xuvats made the motion similar to a bodybuilder flexing, and separated all of the bones from each other. They then walked over to the envelope, sloughing off a trail of bones and armor as they went. They retrieved the envelope from the rubble and debris-strewn floor, to find it sealed with a wax sigil. Rondell pointed out that the sigil was a ring of snakes, like the statue in the previous room, but that this ring had a thin spiral that wound from the outer edge of the ring to its center. She used a dagger to open the envelope without breaking the seal, and inside they found written 3 words in Celestial: invite, blame, protect. What the fuck does that mean? Rondell asked, holding the letter up for Xuvats to examine. Invite means to encourage another to join, Xuvats began to explain, but the paladin cut them off. It was a rhetorical question. Looking around this room, they found a total of 7 doors, 3 of which led back the way they had come. There were 2 more doors directly opposite those on the north wall, and the last 2 were opposite each other on the east and west walls. They began with the door on the east wall, which they found locked. Xuvats attempted to pick the lock, but was unsuccessful. Rondell used her short sword to mark the door with an X, and they moved on to the next one, to the right. As they crossed the floor, the paladin noticed an unusual pattern in the obsidian brickwork in a part of the north wall, and on investigating found a hidden door. It opened to a passage that extended 40 cubits before ending in a T-junction, with the option to go east or west. Both east and west passages led to stairs leading down to the next level. They felt it best to return to the last room and continue clearing the other doors so that they would not be surprised from behind once they descended to the next level. The next door they inspected was a large stone door with no handle and no locks. Instead, the door had a single gem set into it. After about 15 minutes of the puzzle eluding them, Xuvats noticed the torchlight that lit the room, gleaming off the paladin's scale mail, was creating tiny spotlights on the obsidian stone walls. "May I see your weapon?" the alien asked. Rondell drew the sword and immediately understood what Xuvats' idea was. She held the sword up to reflect the torchlight off the steel and illuminated the gem in the door. The gem began to glow, and then the door opened into a room about 40 cubits square. In the room was a flying creature in a cloud of dust hovering over a young dwarf laying unconscious on the floor. Rondell rushed to put herself between the Mephit and the dwarf, swinging her sword as she ran, but the elemental easily dodged the attack. Xuvats, seeing this, also moved in, helping to corner the creature. With an axe-shaped pseudopod, Xuvats carved through the Mephit with a cloud of dust. Wounded, the dust Mephit retreated to the corner further, and released a torrent of dirt and fine particulate to blind them both. But the bugbear was able to shield her eyes in time, and Xuvats was without eyes. Rondell took another swing while the elemental thought they were blinded, and drove her sword deep into the creature. It began to flail wildly, and Xuvats put it down with a final blow. "Get back!" Rondell shouted, ducking behind her shield. The Mephit exploded into a cloud of dust that completely coated Xuvats' membrane, making the plasmoid unable to interpret photonic energy and rendering them essentially blind. While they attempted to absorb and process the dust, Rondell checked on the dwarf, but she had unfortunately not survived. The door at the back of the room opened into a westbound passage that eventually circled around until they were back into the room where they'd found the envelope. The next door, still working their way clockwise, held another puzzling lock with a similar gem. The same tactic, however, was not successful on this door. Searching around the room, Xuvats found another similar gem in a fake door embedded in the adjacent wall. Rondell noticed that the gem from the first door projected a small red dot onto the opposite wall, and together they were able to reflect the light from the one gem to the second to open the door. The room was 50 cubits square, and contained the remains of a creature the paladin called a maw demon, though the way the fiend was smashed into a fine pulp almost caused Rondell to vomit at the sight of it.
On the north and east walls were additional doors. They opened the north door to the sound of gears grinding, and the floor suddenly dropped out from under them. But both explorers were able to move away before they fell the 15 cubits into the bottom of the pit. They crossed over the pit trap into a circular room that was 15 cubits across and held only some old, mostly broken furniture, and the occasional rat here and there.
They moved towards the door on their right, but as they did, 3 rats collected there in front of them. Then, another rat ran up to Xuvats and sunk its teeth into the use's membrane. The plasmoid slumped over the creature to absorb the live rat, but it began flailing wildly inside its vacuole, clawing and scratching at Xuvats from inside. Suddenly, rats came at the alien from all sides, biting and clawing at its outer membrane, though not causing much damage. Rondell tried to swat a few of the rats off the blob, but they seemed to sense her attacks before she could land them. Then 2 rats turned and attacked her, but were unable to get through the chainmail armor or her thick fur. Xuvats ejected the flailing rat within them with such force that it exploded into a bloody mess against the wall and dropped to the floor with a weak pat.
The other rats continued their assault, causing Xuvats genuine harm. But as they killed off the rats one at a time, they began getting easier to catch, until the last one was finally destroyed. It was then that Rondell noticed that the rat's brains were exposed, as though the cap of the skull had been removed. "Is it not supposed to be exposed?" Xuvat asked.
"Fucking no,"
the bugbear replied. "I've heard rumors, though, about rats that can talk to each other, telepathically," she continued. "That they're made that way to act as spies." "Spies for whom? And for what purpose?" Xuvats asked, getting only a shrug in response.
Rondell watched Xuvats absorb one of the dead rats through its outer membrane. As it passed through Xuvats' ectoplasmic layer and into the endoplasm, a vacuole formed around it. That vacuole quickly filled with fluid that began to dissolve the rat, forming bubbles of different colors all over it. Those would float up and collect together into larger bubbles of different types. Some of those would then be broken down further, and some would be stored in vacuoles in various quantities. These appeared to be then distributed throughout its body in such a way that they were unnoticeable in passing, but on inspection appeared as fine particulate. The whole process taking about a solar day, Xuvats explained. "That's incredible," the bugbear stated. "Thank you. This rodent's metabolism functions in a similar yet slightly less efficient manner." While this was happening, Xuvats also began to reabsorb some of the damaged parts of its outer membrane, and similarly process them. Rondell examined one of the scars. It wasn't deep enough to breach the membrane, and so it simply looked like someone had scraped a fork across gelatin. "Does that hurt?" "Oh yes," Xuvats replied. "I wonder." The bugbear reached out with a clawed hand and held it just above one of the slashes in Xuvats' membrane. Her hand began to glow from the palm as she said a prayer. "How curious," Xuvats exclaimed. "I am unfamiliar with the celestial Veros, but his dual lattice cross-polymerization technique is extraordinary. Do you know the celestial Kevin? I met him on the Dorado territory during the Nargalos putrefaction." "The what now?" Rondell removed her hand to see that the scar was gone. "Did that hurt any less?" "Oh no, that was significantly more painful," Xuvats replied. Rondell apologized to the alien, but they rebutted it. On the contrary, it was painful in precise correlation to its expediency. She stared blankly at Xuvats. "It hurt, but not for very long," the alien clarified. They arrived at the far door in the circular room, taking the time to inspect it for traps. The door opened to a narrow passage that widened via an archway to an adjacent passage after 10 cubits. To the north, the passage ended after 10 cubits. To the south, the passage widened to 20 cubits, and continued to an intersection lined with miscellaneous detritus and rubble. Xuvats stepped into a pile of the rubble and absorbed its contents for analysis by breaking it down into its base components and cataloging its molecular makeup. They had already begun digesting the journal when Rondell noticed it suspended inside of them. What is that?" she asked. "It appears to be pulp parchment bound in animal carcass," Xuvats began, before being interrupted. "May I see it?" Rondell asked, stopping in the corridor. Xuvats passed over the book, which was only slightly dissolved around the edges. Though neither of them could read the language, the notes appeared to be journal entries, as they were dated, though in an unknown format. Rondell found that the entries suddenly stopped in mid-sentence, and further, that another had begun vandalizing the journal with mocking pictures of spears pointed towards certain words or phrases, and drawings of pigs, penises, and turds. They found a door that led back to the room where they discovered the skeleton, and an opposing eastern branching corridor. As they moved down the eastern corridor, they could hear the buzzing of insects. The corridor ended in a pentagonal room covered in hatching nodules and swarming insects. And as soon as the insects began to bite, Rondell noped back the way they had come, explaining how she hated flying insects, even as she swatted dead any that followed. They went back to the south corridor, which eventually led them back to the room with the flaming statue. Having spent the entire day exploring this level, they decided to retire to room 3, where they had met, to set up camp for the night. During the evening, Rondell told a story of a guard, someone she'd known, that had betrayed their faith and stolen a relic of power. She explained that it was her responsibility to recover the relic. "The scrolls foretell of a coming cataclysm, and so I must recover our only defense against it." "Indeed," Xuvats agreed. "I was among the thrall of Thara VS when the cleansing rains fell, and you wanted to be beneath the slab of luminosity on that day, let me tell you." The remainder of the night was uneventful. Having just come from cosmic hibernation, and not needing to sleep for the next 1,000 cycles, Xuvats kept watch.